A Bigfoot creature was stirring. The bullet came out of nowhere and hit Buffalo Newcomb as he straightened from the spot where he'd been kneeling beside a fast-flowing creek. He'd been trying to reach into the water and grab one of the trout that swam by, tantalizing him. For such a big man, his hands were incredibly fast. The impact was like a hammer blow on the back of his left shoulder. It made him stumble forward, and since he was a little off balance to start with, he had no chance to catch himself. He toppled forward into the creek with a huge splash. "I got him! I got me a Bigfoot!" Well, that was just rude, thought Buffalo as his face went under the icy water and he came up sputtering. True, he was big, and there was no denying he was pretty hairy as well, especially in the long, shaggy buffalo hide coat he was wearing. But that didn't mean he could pass for a dang beast. On the other hand, he told himself as he tried to crawl out of the stream, he supposed there was a slight resemblance. Buffalo's muscles wouldn't cooperate with what he wanted them to do. His whole left side was numb. He wound up flopping around at the edge of the creek like one of those trout would if he'd caught it and tossed it up on the bank. It was humiliating. Not to mention dangerous, because whoever had shot him was still out there in the woods and might come along to finish the job. Buffalo lifted his head and looked around, searching for any signs of the bushwhacker. Well, rugged mountains rose all around him. The trees that covered their slopes were mantled in a white from the snow that had fallen a few days earlier, but most of the snow on the ground had melted. The winds off the Pacific kept it from getting too cold on this side of the Cascades, even in December. It was a beautiful country, but Buffalo didn't see anybody moving around in it. Even the birds had flown off, spooked by the shot. Buffalo thought back on that shot. He'd heard the report at the same instant as he was hit. Hadn't sounded like a particularly big gun, he thought, but big enough to put him on the ground, obviously. And the voice that had called out exultingly, yelling about getting a Bigfoot, it had been a high-pitched, like that of a woman or a kid. Buffalo turned his head toward a sudden rustling in the brush, so he was looking straight at the spot where a boy about 9 or 10 years old suddenly appeared, carrying a single-shot rifle, a battered old hat crammed down on a stalk of reddish-blonde hair. The kid stopped short and stared in surprise at Buffalo, who looked right back at him. "You ain't a Bigfoot," the boy finally said. "You're a man. I shot a man." Buffalo would have agreed with that, but all he could do was groan. A wave of bleak weakness washed over him, and his head fell forward. That put his face under water again. He reckoned he was going to die here, drowned in a half a foot of water, and there wasn't a blasted thing he could do about it. That thought was the last thing that went through his mind before he passed out. "Just lie still," the woman's voice said. "I got the bullet out, and I'll have the wound bandaged in a moment." Buffalo didn't know where he was, but he wasn't dead, so that was something to be thankful for. His shoulder and his side weren't numb anymore either. In fact, they hurt like blazes. He was almost thankful for that because the pain proved that he was still alive and he wasn't seeing an angel kneeling over him. "Is he going to die, Ma? Is he?" "No, I don't think so, Tom. No thanks to you. Aw, if I'd known he was a man, I wouldn't have shot him. I seen him hunkered there beside the creek, and I thought for sure he was a Bigfoot." "Yes, I know," the woman said with a dry tone of disapproval in her voice. "And if he had been a creature like that, and you only wounded him, what do you think would have happened when you came running up on him like you told me?" "Well, I guess he probably would have et me." The woman heaved a frustrated sigh and said, "He would have eaten you, and I don't suppose it would do any good to correct your other grammatical mistakes either, would it?" "Probably not," the kid said. "Is he awake?" "I think so. He stirred around a little a minute ago." While the woman was talking, she continued patching up the wound in Buffalo's shoulder. Her hands were strong but gentle as she tied a bandage around him. He realized he was lying face down on some sort of hard device. A table, maybe, or even on the floor. "There," the woman said. "Sir, are you awake?" Buffalo opened his eyes. "How'd I get here?" "Well, it was difficult for my son and I to drag you here. We couldn't have even gotten you moved without the help of our old mule Bess." "You're saying I'm as big as a buffalo?" "Or a Bigfoot," the boy piped up. His mother shushed him. Buffalo had to chuckle, even though it hurt. "That's all right, kid," he said. "I've been called a lot of things. That's how I come to be known as Buffalo. Only name I got now. Buffalo Newcomb." The woman said, "You do understand, Mr. Newcomb, that my son shot you by accident. You're not angry with him?" "Well, maybe. A little. But yeah, I understand." "Good." She sounded relieved. "You can stay here, and we'll be glad to take care of you while you recover. You can have my bunk, but you'll have to get up and walk to it by yourself. Like I said, we can't lift you." Well, Buffalo was feeling groggy again. He said, "If it's all right with you, ma'am, reckon I'll just rest here a mite. I'll feel better then. You can just walk around me." She smiled, and that was what Buffalo realized how doggone pretty she was, and with that fluffy fair hair around her face and eyes deep enough and blue enough for a fella to swim around in. If a man had to pass out, as he was in the midst of doing, he could do worse than having that sight be the last thing he saw for a while. As Buffalo predicted, when he woke up again he felt better. Some of his strength had come back. All the rugged years he had spent on the frontier, adventuring from south of the Rio Grande and north of the Milk River, had given him an iron constitution. Now that rifle shot might have knocked him down and out for a little while, but it really wasn't that bad. He was even able to stand up with the help of the woman and the boy and walk over to sit down on a bench at a rough-hewn table. The woman, she put a cup of coffee and a bowl of stew in front of him. And Buffalo realized that he was even hungrier than he thought when he was trying to catch that fish. "I'm much obliged to you," he said, around a bite he had taken from the hunk of bread she gave him as well. "Been a while since I et, and fella as big as me needs fuel." "See, Ma," the kid said, "Mr. Newcomb says et too." "Well, that still doesn't make it right." The smile she gave Buffalo took any sting out of the words. "We haven't been properly introduced, Mr. Newcomb. We know your name, but you don't know ours. My name is Ella Villiard, and this is my son, Tommy." "Tom," the boy said. "I'm getting too old to be called Tommy." "Of course," his mother said with a smile. She was wearing a wedding ring, Buffalo noted, but so far he hadn't seen any sign of a husband around here. She had said that she and Tom couldn't lift him by themselves. Of course, it was possible that her husband was just gone somewhere and would be back soon. None of his business anyway, Buffalo reminded himself. He ate half that bowl of stew, slurped down several swallows of the coffee, and then he paused to say, "I had a horse. Tom brought it in. It's in our shed out back, along with our mule." Buffalo glanced around the cabin. It was like 100 other cabins he'd seen. But Ella had tried to put some homey touches to it. The windows had curtains on them, and there were rugs here and there on the floor. The cabin had only one room and a loft, but some blankets had been hung up to close off a part of it, probably where the woman's bed was. The boy probably slept in the loft. And Tom's single-shot rifle leaned against the wall near the door. A Henry repeater was hung up on pegs, and so was a double-barreled shotgun. The weapons appeared to be well cared for. That was an inclination there was a man around the place. Either that or Ella Villiard knew that there were times on the frontier when a person's life depended on a gun doing what it was supposed to do. "If you don't mind my curiosity, Mr. Newcomb, what brings you to this part of Oregon?" she asked as she sat on the bench the other side of the table. "My horse in the wind," Buffalo replied. "I'm a drifter, ma'am. Pretty much no account." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Ella protested. "You seem like an intelligent man, if not an overly educated one." Buffalo used his sleeve to wipe away some stew that had dribbled onto the thick, bushy black beard. "Like I told you, I've been called a lot of things," he said. "I ain't sure intelligence ever been one of 'em." But in truth, he was smart enough to have lived this long, he thought. That had to count for something, especially when a man had lived a troubled life with stints on both sides of the law. He'd had a fortune in his hands on several occasions. But somehow riches were like water. He just couldn't hold on to 'em. He had knife and claw and bullet scars all over his massive body, and his knuckles were knobby from all the pounding he'd done on cussed varmints who deserved a good thrashing. He'd just about burned up under a blazing sun, and he'd come close to freezing to death more times than he liked to think about. But he had endured, and that was why he wasn't worried about a piddling little bullet hole. "I'm feeling a heap better already," he went on. "Soon's I finish this here meal, which is mighty good, by the way, I reckon I'll be on my way so's I don't bother you folks no more." Ella looked surprised. "But you're injured," she said. "You shouldn't be traveling right away. You should rest and recover for a few days first." "Aw, shoot, I'll be fine." "No," she said firmly, "I insist." Buffalo's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Villiard might not like it when he gets back and finds a big galoots like me with his wife and kid." Ella's lips tightened and Tom looked away. Buffalo wished he could take back the words. "My late husband would have extended his hospitality to you every bit as much as we do, Mr. Newcomb," Ella had said. "Besides, there's another reason you shouldn't leave. In 3 more days it'll be Christmas, and no one should be alone at Christmas time." Christmas wasn't something Buffalo thought about very often. One day was pretty much like another when you were just drifting along through life. But he supposed it wouldn't hurt to celebrate a holiday for a change. Besides, Ella was a good cook, and if there was one thing he liked, it was good food and plenty of it. His strength came back quickly over the next 24 hours, and during that time he also learned more about Ella Villiard and her son. Tom liked to talk, and although his mother tried to shush him now and then, it didn't do much good. Andre Villiard had been French-Canadian, a trapper who came down across the border and found himself this nice little valley in Oregon. He'd decided this would be a perfect place for a man to settle down, farm a little, maybe raise a few horses. He would need a wife to do things right, though. He found her in Portland. Buffalo didn't know what Ella had been doing there. She could have been anything from a seamstress to a soiled dove. What mattered was that she'd been willing to marry Andre Villiard and come with him to this valley on the western slopes of the Cascades, where they'd had a son and lived in relative peace and prosperity for a number of years before Andre came down with the fever that killed him. "He's buried up the hill," Tom said of his father, "along with my little brother and sister who didn't make it." The boy said it matter-of-factly, and when Buffalo glanced at Ella, he didn't see any particular reaction on her face. Life on the frontier was full of tragedies. People either learned to live with that pain or it would eat them up from the inside out. "Ma and me tried to keep on raising horses like my pa did," Tom went on. "But we ain't done so good at it. They're all gone now, so we just farm a little." "What happened to the horses?" Buffalo asked. "They wandered off," Ella said before Tom could answer. "They'll do that." Yeah, they would, thought Buffalo, but something about her hurried answer made him think there might be more to it than that. He set that aside to think about later and asked, "Indians ever bother you?" "The Indians around here are peaceful," Ella said. "We don't have any trouble with them. All we got to worry about are Bigfoots, like I thought you were, Mr. Newcomb. Sometimes we hear 'em howling up in the mountains, and they come down around now and then and spook all the animals. They killed some cows over at the Rainey place." "We don't know that that's true, Tom," Ella said. It could have been wolves that attacked Mr. Rainey's stock." Tom shook his head and said, "No, it was a Bigfoot. They got it in for him because he sends his men out to hunt 'em. They've killed 2 or 3 Bigfoot already. They've shot at things they said were Bigfoots, but no one has ever found any bodies or any proof at all that such creatures exist, now have they?" "What about the footprints I saw in our garden?" Tom asked. Ella frowned, but she didn't say anything. Whatever made that print had a bigger foot than even Mr. Newcomb here, Tom went on. It couldn't have been a regular man. You believe in Bigfoot, don't you, Mr. Newcomb? Well, Buffalo scratched at his beard and he said, well, I've heard plenty of stories about the varmints, Tom. Don't reckon I've ever seen one with my own eyes, though, or even any tracks that might have been made, so you're ahead of me on that score. Well, the Indians talk about 'em. They've been here in these parts longer than anybody else, longer even than the Indians. So I hear, Buffalo said with a nod. That's quite enough talk about Bigfoot, Ella said. Tom, it's time to wash up for supper. The boy didn't argue. Nobody in his right mind would argue when it came to eating his ma's food, thought Buffalo. Ella was good at making do with what she had, which in this case was salt pork, beans, and some corn she had put up the previous summer, along with some biscuits and molasses and buttermilk. As he ate, Buffalo started to worry that he was putting too big a dent in their provisions. If he weren't careful, he might wind up eating them out of house and home, he told himself. Maybe before he moved on, he could do some hunting and see to it that they had enough meat to last for a while. They were just finishing up the meal when hoofbeats sounded. 2 or 3 horses came to a stop outside the cabin, Buffalo judged. Ella's head lifted and her nostrils flared slightly as she drew in a deep breath. You expecting company? Buffalo asked quietly. He had his Colt and his Winchester if this turned out to be trouble. Ella shook her head and said, no, I'm sure it's just one of the neighbors come to call. She stood up and went to the door. Buffalo thought that she ought to be more careful, but she opened it without waiting to see who the visitors were. Maybe she really knew and just didn't want to say, he thought. Hello, Mr. Rainey, she said as she stood in the doorway. From the side of his mouth, Buffalo asked Tom, who's that? Jed Rainey, the boy replied, equally quiet. He's our neighbor. Got the biggest ranch in these parts. And he sends his men out to hunt Bigfoot. Yeah, Tom's mouth twisted, and he comes to see Ma. I don't like him much. Things went on between grown-ups that kids didn't understand. But Buffalo had also found that youngsters usually had pretty solid instincts. If Tom didn't like Jed Rainey, there might be a good reason for it. Ella stepped back to let the man into the cabin. He moved into the doorway, taking off his hat as he did so. Rainey was a man in his 30s with a shock of sandy hair, the sort of gent that a lot of women would find attractive. He was dressed like a working rancher, nothing really that fancy about his clothes or his hat, but he carried himself with a self-confidence that bordered on arrogance. Buffalo didn't like him either. Hello, Ella, Rainey said. You're looking as... Buffalo figured the man had been about to say beautiful as ever, but Rainey stopped short at the sight of him sitting at the table with Tom. The surprised pause lasted just a second, though, before Rainey went on. Well, who's this? This is Mr. Newcomb, Ella said. He was injured in an accident near here, so he's staying with us while he recovers. I shot him, Tom said. Thought he was a Bigfoot. Rainey grunted and said, I can see why. He lifted a hand. My apologies, Mr. Newcomb. That was rude of me, especially since we've just met. Don't worry about it, Buffalo said. I know I'm pretty big and hairy and mean-looking. Not at all, Rainey said. It's just that I have a bit of a grudge against the beasts. They've raided my herd more than once. He looked over at Ella. I'm fairly certain they're to blame for your horses disappearing, too. You and Tommy really shouldn't... We don't need to talk about this now, Jed, Ella said, interrupting him. He looked annoyed for a second, but then he shrugged and said, well, you're right. He came over to the table and held out his hand. I'm Jedediah Rainey. Buffalo Newcomb. Buffalo's big, thick-fingered hand practically swallowed up the other man's hand in its grip. That's an unusual name. Tom said it's because he's as big as a buffalo or a Bigfoot. Yes. Are you going to be around here long, Mr. Newcomb? Well, what business is that of yours? Buffalo asked. Rainey's eyes narrowed, but he kept his voice level and pleasant as he said, I just thought that if you are, I ought to warn my men that you're around. You see, they have standing orders to shoot any big, hairy creatures they see. We wouldn't want anything to happen to you. Before Buffalo could say anything, Rainey turned away dismissively and said to Ella, I came to wish you and Tom a Merry Christmas and invite you to spend the holiday at my ranch. I don't think we could do that, Ella replied with a shake of her head. I'm not sure it would be proper. It would be if we were engaged to be married. Well, that was plain enough, Buffalo thought, and it came as no surprise to him either. As soon as Rainey came into the room, Buffalo had been able to tell from the look in the man's eye that he wanted Ella Villiard. Rainey struck him as the sort of man who usually got what he wanted, too, no matter what it took. Ella's mouth tightened. She said, I'm sorry, Jed, we've talked about this. I've no interest in marrying you. The boy could use a father. I had a pa, Tom said. He died. Ella, Rainey began again. She gave a little shake of her head. It was emphatic enough to make him stop arguing. All right, he said, forcing a smile back onto his face. Buffalo saw anger in his eyes. I'll settle for wishing you a Merry Christmas then. We'll talk again after the holiday. You're always welcome, Jed, she told him, but my answer won't change. Rainey jerked his head in a curt nod. He turned back toward the door, putting his hand on his hat as he did so. Buffalo stopped him by saying, Rainey? The rancher looked back at him without a trace of friendliness in his gaze. What is it? A couple of men rode up with you. That's right, 2 of my hands. No one rides alone these days, not since the Bigfoot have gotten more daring. Yeah, I wondered about that, Buffalo said, and I never answered your question earlier. I figure I'll be around here for a while. Well then, you'd better be careful no one mistakes you for something you're not. With that, Rainey went out into the night and closed the door behind him a little harder than necessary. Ella was quiet and withdrawn the rest of the evening. If Tom had noticed all the undercurrents going on while Rainey was there, he didn't show any sign of it. Buffalo had insisted on sleeping on the floor the previous night. He wasn't going to take Ella's bed away from her. She had argued with him, but he wouldn't be budged. So she had made up a pallet for him near the fireplace. That was where he slept again tonight. Tom had gone to bed and the fire had burned down so that it gave off only a faint red glow. Ella and Buffalo sat up talking quietly. I feel I owe you an explanation. You don't owe me nothing, ma'am. I think I do, she said, since you seem to have found yourself involved in my trouble. By trouble, you mean Jed Rainey? Yes, he waited a few months after Andre passed away, but since then he's been a very persistent suitor. Ma'am, please call me Ella. Buffalo shrugged. If there is any chance that this fellow Rainey might have had anything to do with your husband dying, Ella? No chance at all. Andre died of a fever, but Mr. Rainey was quick to try to take advantage of that tragedy. So he ain't a murderer, just a skunk? And a horse thief, Ella said. Buffalo sat up straighter. You think he's behind those horses of yours disappearing? I do, she said. I believe he thought that if he could make things difficult for Tom and me, then I would have no choice but to marry him. You got any proof of that? No, not really, but he said something about the horses being gone before I ever mentioned it to him. It was a slip of the tongue, but enough to convince me. Buffalo grunted. Me too. You ought to go to the law, and I ain't normally one for saying that, since me and the law ain't always got along so good. She smiled and said, You may not have always been on the side of the law, Mr. Newcomb, but I have to believe you were always on the side of what was right. Anyway, Jed Rainey is a rich man, a powerful man, and if I married him, he could give Tom a better life. I ain't so sure Tom would see it that way. Well, maybe not, but Tom's a boy. It's not his decision to make. No, ma'am, and it ain't mine either, Buffalo said. Buffalo felt even better the next day. When Ella changed the bandage on his wounded shoulder, she said, Land's sake, this is healing so fast I've never seen anything like it. Good clean living, that's what does it, Buffalo said with a grin. He was pretty sure he could have saddled up and moved on that day, but it was Christmas Eve, and Ella had asked him to stay. The sky was leaden gray that morning, and by afternoon snowflakes began to spit down, gradually thickening until the ground started to turn white again. This was the sort of night when the Bigfoot roams, Tom said, as he went about his evening chores, which consisted of seeing that the mule and Buffalo's horse and the milk cow had plenty of grain and water. Buffalo had come outside with him, a little tired of sitting around in the cabin, no matter how pleasant it was. It's Christmas Eve, Buffalo said. Don't you reckon the Bigfoot is at home with his family, like everybody else? Tom cast an apprehensive glance toward the mountains, which loomed darkly over the cabin in the fading light. How would a Bigfoot know it's Christmas Eve, he asked. Well, Buffalo didn't have an answer for that question. When they went back inside, the smell coming from the stew pot on the stove was delicious. Ella had picked some red berries from a bush, strung them together, and hung them up above the fireplace, giving the room a festive air. Before they ate, Ella set a small package on the table and said, "This is for you, Tom. Merry Christmas." "A present?" he said, with his eyes widening. "Aw, Ma, I don't have anything for you." "It's all right," she told him. "I saw it at the trading post and I wanted you to have it." Brown paper was wrapped around the package. Tom tore it off, revealing a small box of licorice sticks. His eyes lit up with happiness at the sight. "Ma, I love these." "I know," Ella said with a smile. "Mr. Newcomb, I'm afraid I don't have anything for you. I didn't know you'd be here with us last time I was in the settlement." "Don't you worry about it, ma'am," he said. "Getting to spend time with you and Tom here is just about the best Christmas present an old coot like me could get, I reckon." "Well, that's very sweet of you. Let me get the bowls for the stew." She stopped short as Buffalo's horse neighed in the shed that butted up against the rear of the cabin. Steel-shod hooves thudded against the log walls as the animal kicked in fear. The cow let out a frantic moo. "Something's out there," Tom said. "The Bigfoot." "No," Ella said. "Tom, there's no such thing." Tom grabbed the barrel of his rifle where it leaned against the wall when Buffalo's hand came down on his shoulder. "Hold on there, young'un. Maybe there's such a thing as Bigfoot and maybe there ain't. But I know good and well there's wolves in these parts, and that's probably what's out there." He fetched his Winchester from the corner where his sleeping pallet was spread out. "I'll go take a look." "Please be careful," Ella told him. "I'll be fine," he said, even if he wasn't quite at full strength. He was confident that he was a match for anything he might run into out there, especially with the rifle in his hands. There weren't many critters that could stand up to a half dozen 44-40 rounds. He shrugged into the buffalo hide coat and crammed his old hat down on his tangled mess of dark hair. He pointed a finger at Tom and said, "You stay in here with your mom. Don't try to slip out after me." Ella stepped up and rested a hand on her son's shoulder to make sure of that. Buffalo opened the door and stepped outside, quickly pulling it closed behind him. Full night had fallen, and with the snowstorm going on, it was a dark one. He couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction as he started around the corner of the cabin toward the shed. With no warning, something crashed onto his head, staggering him. Something else slammed into the wounded shoulder and made pain explode through his body. For a second, he thought Tom had been right after all, and he'd run smack dab into an angry Bigfoot. Then he was driven to his knees by another blow to his head, and somebody kicked him in the back. A man laughed. That was no Bigfoot. "Teach a saddle tramp a lesson, boys. Give him a good beating. Put him on his horse and send him on his way." "A man's liable to freeze to death on a night like this, boss," another voice said, "especially a man who's beat up and hurt." "I don't care about that," Jed Rainey said. "Just do what I told you." Rainey's voice had a slight slur to it. Buffalo caught a faint whiff of whiskey. Rainey was drunk. He'd probably been sitting in his ranch house guzzling rot gut and brooding because he couldn't get what he wanted on Christmas Eve. What he wanted was Ella, and he had come to take her, whether she wanted to go with him or not. Rainey confirmed that by adding, "Get to it while I take the woman and boy back to the ranch." Buffalo lifted his head. His hat had fallen off when he was knocked down, and his hair had tumbled into his eyes. But he could make out the dark bulk of a buckboard with a couple of horses hitched to it, along with 3 saddle mounts. So Rainey had brought 3 men with him. Well, that ought to be interesting, thought Buffalo. Rainey jerked the cabin door open. "I've come for you, Ella," he yelled. "You're going to be my wife, the way you were meant to be." Inside the cabin, Ella screamed. Buffalo turned his head to look up and bared his teeth in a snarl. His head was spinning, and he felt blood leaking from the wound in his shoulder. But the anger that fueled up in him more than made up for those things. He surged up from the ground and swung an arm in a backhanded blow that caught one of the punchers across the chest and threw him backwards a good 10 feet. The cowboy slammed into a tree and bounced off. Another man was holding a rifle. Instead of firing it, he tried to drive the stock against Buffalo's head. Buffalo had flashed up and caught the weapon in midair, stopping it inches away. A powerful wrench of his arm tore the rifle from the man's grasp. Buffalo swung it away in the darkness. The third man leaped on Buffalo's back. He wrapped his arms around Buffalo's neck and yelled, "I got him, Cody. I'll hang on to him while you..." With what he had in mind for Cody to do, he didn't get a chance to finish the suggestion. Buffalo reached up and took a hold of the man's arms. He pried them loose and let go of one of them, while he held on to the other and used it to swing the man like a kid might swing a rag doll by the arm. The cowboy screeched in pain. The cry was cut off as he smashed into his companion. Both men went down, sprawling limp and senseless on the ground. That just left Rainey, Buffalo thought as he turned toward the cabin. They appeared in the doorway, Rainey with Ella struggling in his arms as he dragged her out. Tom running around them, striking at the rancher. Rainey must have got tired of it because he took one hand off of Ella and hit Tom in the side of the head and knocked him down. Ella screamed again, but this time more in anger than fear. She thrashed around and had one arm loose now. She dragged her nails down Rainey's face like claws. He reacted with a bellow and a shove that sent Ella into the door jamb. She fell down. "Rainey!" Buffalo yelled. Rainey's head jerked towards the sound. The rancher took a sudden step to the side and his eyes widened. "Bigfoot!" he shouted. "My God, it's Bigfoot!" Buffalo supposed that's what he looked like, lumbering through the snow towards Rainey. Rainey thought so anyway. He reached under his coat and his hand came out with a gun in it, a revolver that roared and spouted flame. Not even the rage that filled him was enough to make Buffalo charge right into a handful of .45 slugs. He hit the ground as the bullets tore through the air above him. Snow kicked up in his face. Rainey's gun clicked on an empty chamber. He whirled around and ran, shouting, "Bigfoot! Bigfoot!" The varmint was so drunk he would probably run smack dab into a tree and bash his brains out, Buffalo thought as he hauled himself to his feet. They could hope, anyway. He hurried over to Ella and tried to help her up. "Tommy," she said, shaking him off. "See if Tommy's all right." Well, Buffalo picked up the boy and was shaking his head and blinking his eyes. "You'll be all right, son," Buffalo told him. He turned his head to look at Ella, who had gotten to her feet. "He's just a mite shaken up is all." "Buffalo," she said, looking past him. He set Tom on the ground beside her and turned to see that Rainey's 3 punchers were up again, hanging back as if they weren't sure what to do next. Rainey was off up the slope somewhere, still yelling. Suddenly, his yell turned into a scream of pure terror, with another sound blended with it, a guttural howl that was like nothing Buffalo had ever heard before. It sure weren't human, and it didn't sound like any animal he'd ever encountered. One of the cowboys gulped and said, "Good Lord, is that a..." He couldn't bring himself to finish. One of the other men said in a weak voice, "It sure sounded like it." Rainey's scream stopped. The howl went on for a few seconds longer, then trailed away as if whatever it was moving off, going higher into the mountains. "Don't look so surprised," Buffalo told the 3 punchers. "The drunken fool was calling it." They found Rainey's torn-up remains about 500 yards from the cabin. The snow was badly messed up around the body, of course, but by the light of the torch one of the cowboys carried, Buffalo saw one vaguely human-shaped footprint, but it was bigger than any human foot he'd ever seen. He knew the 3 punchers saw it too. But, as if by common agreement, nobody said anything about it. In fact, one of the men brushed it away with his own boot, seemingly by accident, and said, "Wolves, that's what got the boss, a pack of wolves." "Yeah," Buffalo said, "wolves." "You know," one of the other cowboys said, "we never wanted to come over here with him, Newcomb. It ain't right what he tried to do, but we ride for the brand, you know?" Buffalo nodded. "I expect whoever takes over Rainey's ranch will make sure Miss Villiard's horses are returned and she's left alone from here on out." "I reckon you can count on that," the man said, and the other 2 punchers nodded emphatically. By morning the snowstorm had moved on. Buffalo saddled his horse and got ready to do the same. Wrapped in a thick coat, Ella came out to the shed. "You don't have to leave, you know," she said. There's a place here for you, Buffalo. I can't think of a better Christmas present for me." "Aw, you're just getting carried away with the spirit of the season," Buffalo told her. "Trust me, it don't take me long for me to wear out my welcome. That's why I'm always on the drift. I ain't the most sociable cuss that ever was. You never thought about settling down?" "No, ma'am, never have." "Well, I'd like to change your mind about that. So would Tom. Think about it, will you?" Buffalo glanced up the mountainside, and he smiled.